Japanese pilots mocked America's radar until B-17 crews detected them before dawn. January 17, 1943. 0447 hours. 23,000 feet above the Solomon Sea. The cockpit of the B-17 Flying Fortress trembled with the steady rhythm of 4 Wright Cyclone engines cutting through pre-dawn darkness. Staff Sergeant Robert Henley pressed his face against the frozen glass of the radio operator's compartment, watching stars fade into that peculiar gray that comes just before tropical sunrise. The air inside smelled of hydraulic fluid, sweat, and the metallic tang of fear that no amount of ventilation could clear. His hands moved across the radar scope before him, a circular green screen that had been installed just 6 weeks earlier, still so new that condensation formed on its edges in the humid Pacific air. The technology hummed with an electric persistence that seemed almost alive. Henley wasn't looking at stars anymore. He was watching ghosts appear on that screen. Blips. 16 of them. Moving fast. Closing distance. Bandits, he said into the intercom, his voice steady despite the ice forming in his chest. Bearing 270. Range 18 miles. Coming in hot. The pilot's response crackled back. You sure about that, Henley? I don't see a damn thing out there. But Henley was sure. The radar didn't lie. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, 16 Japanese pilots were about to learn that the war had changed in ways their training had never prepared them for. The Pacific Theater in early 1943 existed in a state of brutal equilibrium. After the catastrophic American losses at Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, and the Philippines, the United States had clawed its way back to something approaching parity. The victories at Midway and Guadalcanal had broken Japanese momentum, but they hadn't broken Japanese confidence. Imperial naval aviators remained among the most skilled pilots in the world, men who had trained for years in the rigid discipline of carrier operations, who could nurse a zero through aerobatic maneuvers that would tear apart heavier American aircraft, who had opened the war with such devastating superiority that American pilots had initially been ordered to avoid dogfighting whenever possible. These Japanese pilots operated under a doctrine that prioritized vision, instinct, and raw flying skill. Their training emphasized visual acquisition of targets, the ability to spot enemy aircraft at impossible distances, to read the sky like ancient mariners read the sea. They flew lighter, more maneuverable aircraft. They accepted minimal armor and self-sealing fuel tanks as acceptable trade-offs for performance. And they had developed, through 2 years of combat, an almost religious confidence in their own abilities. This confidence extended to their assessment of American technology. Japanese intelligence officers had compiled extensive reports on American military capabilities throughout 1942, and those reports reflected a consistent theme. American equipment was adequate, sometimes impressive in its brute force approach, but fundamentally unsophisticated. Americans build big, heavy, over-engineered machines. They relied on industrial capacity rather than refined technique. They were, in the estimation of many Japanese commanders, a nation of mechanics trying to fight a war that required artists. Nowhere was this contempt more evident than in Japanese attitudes toward American radar technology. Radio detection and ranging, radar, had been developed independently by multiple nations in the late 1930s. The British had pioneered its use in air defense during the Battle of Britain. The Germans had deployed their own versions for both offensive and defensive purposes. The Americans had begun serious development in 1937, with the Naval Research Laboratory creating increasingly sophisticated systems throughout the pre-war years. By 1943, radar had become a critical component of American naval and air operations, installed on 641 ships, at ground stations, and increasingly, aboard aircraft themselves. But the Japanese had watched these developments with skepticism bordering on derision. Their own radar development had lagged significantly, not because they lacked the technical capability, but because their military doctrine didn't prioritize it. Japanese naval aviation doctrine emphasized the supremacy of the trained human eye, the cultivated instinct, the warrior's sixth sense developed through years of rigorous training. Radar seemed, to many Japanese officers, like a crutch for inferior pilots. a mechanical substitute for skill. Japanese intelligence reports from 1942 characterized American airborne radar as bulky, unreliable, and of limited practical value. One captured document from a Japanese Naval Air Group commander described American radar-equipped aircraft as burdened with unnecessary weight that reduces performance while providing minimal tactical advantage to pilots who lack the training to exploit visual opportunities. Another assessment, circulated among fighter squadrons in the South Pacific, noted that American reliance on detection equipment demonstrates their awareness of inferior pilot skill and inadequate training regimens. This wasn't mere propaganda. It reflected a genuine belief system, one rooted in the extraordinary success Japanese aviators had achieved in the war's opening phases. When your pilots have sunk the Prince of Wales and Repulse, devastated Pearl Harbor, and swept Allied air forces from the skies over the Philippines and Dutch East Indies, you begin to believe your own doctrine is superior. When your Zeros have consistently outmaneuvered American fighters in close combat, you begin to dismiss technologies that seem to compensate for deficiencies you don't possess. The Japanese called it seishin, spirit, fighting spirit, the intangible quality that separated warriors from mere soldiers. Technology could never replace seishin. And radar, in their estimation, was exactly the kind of mechanical crutch that soft, industrial societies depended on when their warriors lacked true fighting spirit. They were about to learn how profoundly wrong that assessment was. The B-17 Flying Fortress represented everything Japanese doctrine taught pilots to exploit. It was massive, a 4-engine heavy bomber that weighed 30 tons fully loaded. It was slow compared to fighters, with a maximum speed of barely 300 miles per hour. It was, on paper, exactly the kind of lumbering target that should have been easy prey for nimble Japanese interceptors. And in the early months of the Pacific War, that's exactly what it had been. Japanese fighters had developed specific tactics for attacking B-17s, approach from below and behind, where the bomber's defensive guns had limited angles of fire, then pull up sharply to rake the aircraft's belly with cannon and machine gun fire. But by January 1943, the B-17s operating in the South Pacific had begun carrying something new. The SCR-720 airborne intercept radar had started appearing in American bombers throughout late 1942, retrofitted into aircraft that were increasingly being used for maritime patrol and long-range reconnaissance. The system consisted of a transmitter, receiver, and display scope, along with a distinctive antenna array that protruded from the aircraft's nose like mechanical antennae sensing invisible currents in the air. The technology was revolutionary, though few people fully appreciated it at the time. For the first time in human history, pilots could see enemy aircraft in complete darkness, through clouds, across dozens of miles. The radar didn't care about camouflage or cloud cover or the human eye's limitations. It detected the radio wave reflections from metal aircraft, translating those reflections into glowing blips on a circular scope. More importantly, it provided American bomber crews with something they desperately needed: advance warning. Time to prepare defensive positions. Time to adjust course. Time to radio for help. In the brutal mathematics of aerial combat, those extra minutes of awareness often meant the difference between survival and a smoking crater in the jungle below. Staff Sergeant Robert Henley had been trained on the SCR-720 system for exactly 12 days before his squadron deployed to Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. The training had been rushed, abbreviated, more focused on basic operation than tactical application. But Henley was a quick study, and he'd spent his off-duty hours experimenting with the equipment, learning its quirks and capabilities. He'd discovered that low-flying aircraft appeared differently than high-altitude contacts. He'd learned to distinguish between friendly formations and enemy attack patterns. He'd figured out how to estimate enemy speed and heading from the rate at which blips moved across his screen. And on this particular morning, 17 miles above the dark water of the Solomon Sea, all that improvised expertise was about to be tested. The Japanese formation consisted of 16 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters. They had launched from Rabaul 2 hours earlier, part of a coordinated sweep intended to intercept American maritime patrol aircraft that had been harassing Japanese shipping convoys. The mission commander, Lieutenant Takeshi Nakamura, was a veteran of the Pearl Harbor attack and the campaigns in the Dutch East Indies. He had 19 confirmed kills and the absolute confidence that came from 2 years of nearly uninterrupted victory. Nakamura's tactical plan was straightforward: approach from the west, using the last of the night's darkness as cover, then strike at sunrise when the Americans would be silhouetted against the brightening eastern sky. It was a classic fighter sweep, the kind of operation Japanese pilots had executed hundreds of times. They would catch the American bomber during its most vulnerable moment, transition from night to day, when human eyes were adjusting, when visual acquisition was most difficult. What Nakamura didn't know, couldn't have known based on his training and experience, was that the American bomber had already detected his formation when they were still 18 miles away. While he and his fellow pilots strained their eyes against the darkness, searching for the first visual contact that their doctrine insisted was the only reliable form of target acquisition, the radar aboard the B-17 had already painted their entire formation with invisible radio waves and was tracking their approach with mechanical precision. The American pilot, Captain James Mitchell, had received Henley's initial warning with the kind of controlled urgency that comes from too many close calls. "Roger that. All gunners to stations. Radio, keep calling out range and bearing." The B-17's 10-man crew snapped into action with the practiced efficiency of men who understood that survival depended on coordination. Gunners chambered rounds into their 50-caliber machine guns. The bombardier abandoned his position in the nose and moved to the front gun turret. The navigator began plotting an evasive course. The flight engineer checked fuel distribution, ready to transfer gas if combat damage required it. And Staff Sergeant Henley kept his eyes locked on that radar scope, calling out updates every 30 seconds. "Bandits now 15 miles. Still closing. They're in a loose formation, looks like they're planning to spread out for a coordinated attack. 12 miles. Bearing unchanged. They don't know we see them. 9 miles. They're starting to climb. Probably trying to get altitude advantage." This was the revolution, playing out in real time. The Japanese pilots were executing a textbook intercept, the kind of approach that had worked flawlessly for 2 years. But their entire tactical advantage had evaporated before the engagement even began. They were no longer the hunters surprising prey at dawn. They were chess players whose opponent could see 3 moves ahead, whose every stratagem was anticipated and countered before it could develop. Captain Mitchell made his decision. "We're not running. Navigation, plot a course directly into that formation. Gunners, prepare for a head-on pass. Radio, alert any friendly fighters in the area, give them our position and the enemy's heading." It was an audacious choice, one that only made sense because of the technological advantage radar provided. Instead of being caught by surprise, the B-17 would turn into the attack, presenting the smallest possible target profile while bringing maximum defensive firepower to bear. The Japanese pilots, expecting to find a lumbering target trying desperately to evade, would instead encounter a bomber flying directly toward them, guns already trained on their approach vector. The engagement began at 0511 hours, just as the first gray light began to distinguish sea from sky. Lieutenant Nakamura spotted the B-17 at 4,000 yards, an excellent visual acquisition distance by any standard. What confused him was the bomber's heading. It was flying directly toward his formation, already positioned for a defensive engagement. There had been no evasive maneuver, no indication that the American crew had been surprised. It was as if they had known exactly where the Japanese formation would be and had positioned themselves accordingly. Impossible. Nakamura dismissed the thought. Perhaps a scout aircraft had spotted them and radioed a warning. Perhaps simple luck. Regardless, 16 zeros against 1 bomber remained overwhelming odds. He gave the attack signal. The Japanese formation split, executing a coordinated pincer movement designed to attack the B-17 from multiple angles simultaneously. 8 fighters would make the initial head-on paw while 8 more swung wide to hit the bomber's flanks once it had been damaged and disoriented. It was a sophisticated tactic, one that required precise timing and communication. But as the first 8 Zeros closed to firing range, they encountered something they hadn't expected: concentrated, accurate defensive fire that began before they had even lined up their own shots. The B-17's nose guns opened up at 3,000 yards, tracers reaching out through the pre-dawn gloom with uncanny accuracy. The top turret joined in at 2,000 yards, its twin 50 calibers adding to the cone of fire that the Japanese fighters had to fly through. 2 Zeros took hits on that first pass. One peeled off trailing smoke. The other pressed its attack, cannon fire walking across the B-17's left wing, but the bomber's structural integrity held. The flying fortress had been designed to absorb tremendous damage and continue flying. Nakamura's second element swept in from the flanks, and again they encountered defensive fire that seemed impossibly well coordinated. The American gunners weren't firing blindly or defensively, they were tracking targets with confidence, leading their shots with precision. What Nakamura couldn't see, couldn't know, was that inside the B-17, Staff Sergeant Henley was still calling out radar contacts, providing the crew with continuous updates on the position and movement of every Japanese fighter in the formation. 3 bandits coming around for another pass from 4 o'clock low. Range 2,000 yards. 2 more breaking right to left at our altitude. The information allowed the American gunners to pre-position their weapons, to anticipate attacks before visual acquisition, to coordinate their fire in ways that would have been impossible without radar guidance. Each gunner knew not just where enemy fighters were at that moment, but where they were going to be, allowing them to set up ambushes in the sky, to create overlapping fields of fire that turned the space around the B-17 into a lethal three-dimensional kill zone. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. In that time, the Japanese formation made 7 coordinated attack runs against the B-17. They damaged the bomber's No. 3 engine, shot out several hydraulic lines, and killed the tail gunner. But they paid a devastating price. 4 Zeros confirmed destroyed, 3 more damaged to the point they had to break off and limp back toward Rabaul. And they never achieved tactical surprise. Not once during the entire engagement did they manage to attack from an angle the Americans hadn't anticipated. Every pass was met with ready defensive fire. Every attempted flanking maneuver was countered before it could develop advantage. At 0522 hours, Lieutenant Nakamura made the hardest decision of his military career. He broke off the attack. The flight back to Rabaul was a silent agony of reassessment. Nakamura had lost 4 pilots, good men, experienced aviators who had survived everything from Pearl Harbor to the Coral Sea. He had failed to destroy a single American bomber, despite commanding a formation of 16 fighters against 1 target. The mathematics of that failure were brutal and impossible to rationalize within the framework of his training. Something had changed. The Americans had demonstrated a capability that shouldn't have existed, that violated every principle Nakamura had been taught about aerial combat. They had known. Somehow, impossibly, they had known exactly where his formation was, even in the darkness before dawn when visual acquisition should have been impossible. When Nakamura filed his after-action report later that morning, he included a detail that his superiors initially dismissed as combat stress or exaggeration. He wrote that the American bomber had demonstrated foreknowledge of our attack vectors that suggests detection capability beyond visual range. He noted that the bomber's defensive fire had begun before normal visual acquisition ranges. He speculated that the Americans may possess technical detection systems more advanced than our intelligence assessments suggest. The report was forwarded up the chain of command, where it joined dozens of similar reports from other Japanese pilots who had encountered American aircraft equipped with radar throughout late 1942 and early 1943. But the pattern remained largely unrecognized by Japanese military intelligence. Their doctrine, their training, their fundamental assumptions about aerial warfare, all of it predisposed them to discount technological explanations for tactical failures. Pilots who submitted reports suggesting American technical superiority were sometimes viewed as making excuses for poor performance. The cultural resistance to acknowledging radar's importance ran deep. Japanese military culture emphasized spiritual and moral factors over material ones. Superior seisin, fighting spirit, was supposed to overcome technical disadvantages. Bushido tradition taught that the warrior's spirit was the ultimate weapon. To suggest that mere machines could determine the outcome of combat seemed to diminish the importance of human courage, skill, and will. Moreover, acknowledging American technical superiority would require acknowledging that Japanese intelligence assessments had been catastrophically wrong, that the Americans they had dismissed as mechanically competent but strategically unsophisticated were actually innovating and adapting faster than Japanese forces could counter. That psychological hurdle proved too high for many commanders to clear. The radar screen became, in those months, a symbol of something larger than technology. It represented a fundamental difference in how American and Japanese military cultures approached warfare. Where Japanese doctrine emphasized the supremacy of the trained warrior, American doctrine increasingly emphasized the supremacy of informed warriors, pilots and crews whose natural abilities were amplified and extended by technology. Where Japanese training sought to cultivate instinct and fighting spirit, American training sought to integrate man and machine into a coordinated system greater than the sum of its parts. The radar scope, glowing green in darkened aircraft compartments across the Pacific, represented the industrialization of awareness itself. It was democracy applied to aerial combat, giving average American crews the ability to compete with Japan's elite aviators. It was the assembly line translated into tactical advantage, mass-producing capability that would have taken years to develop through training alone. And it was utterly, completely effective. By mid-1943, American aircraft equipped with airborne radar were routinely detecting and engaging Japanese formations at distances that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. Night fighters equipped with radar began shooting down Japanese bombers in darkness so complete that visual acquisition was literally impossible. Maritime patrol aircraft began locating and tracking Japanese ships and submarines with a consistency that strangled Japan's supply lines. Bomber formations began coordinating their movements based on radar-derived information, creating defensive formations that were nearly impossible for Japanese fighters to penetrate. The tactical advantages compounded. American pilots equipped with radar developed new tactics that exploited their electronic eyes, head-on attacks that negated Japanese maneuverability advantages, coordinated ambushes in bad weather that Japanese pilots couldn't navigate safely, interceptions at night when Japanese forces had traditionally operated with impunity. Each new tactic forced Japanese forces to adapt, and each adaptation consumed resources and training time that Japan could not afford. But perhaps more devastating than the tactical advantages was the psychological impact. Japanese pilots began to encounter American aircraft that seemed to anticipate their every move, that appeared out of clouds at exactly the wrong moment, that found them in darkness that should have provided cover. The experience was profoundly disorienting for men whose entire training had emphasized the importance of superior vision and situational awareness. Flight Petty Officer Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most successful fighter aces, wrote in his personal journal about encounters with American radar-equipped aircraft. "We trained for years to see further, to sense the enemy's presence, to develop the sixth sense that allows us to survive in combat. But now we face an enemy who can see us when we cannot see them, who can sense our presence through clouds and darkness. What good is our training when machines give them abilities we cannot match through skill alone?" The story of radar in the Pacific War became a story about the clash between two fundamentally different philosophies of warfare. Japanese military culture, rooted in centuries of samurai tradition and shaped by the peculiar pressures of rapid modernization, emphasized the supremacy of human will and spirit. Japanese commanders genuinely believed that moral and spiritual factors could overcome material disadvantages, that Bushido spirit, properly cultivated, could defeat superior technology and industrial capacity. This wasn't naive romanticism. It was a deeply held conviction supported by centuries of cultural tradition and reinforced by the stunning victories of 1941 and early 1942. American military culture, shaped by pragmatism and industrial abundance, emphasized the supremacy of systems and processes. Americans genuinely believed that technological innovation, industrial capacity, and systematic training could overcome individual skill gaps, that average Americans, properly equipped and trained, could defeat elite warriors. This wasn't crude materialism. It was a deeply held conviction supported by the American experience of building continental infrastructure and industrial empires through organized, systematic effort. Radar became the crystallization of these competing philosophies. It was pure American military culture, a machine that gave ordinary crews extraordinary capabilities, that replaced years of training with months of technical instruction, that democratized situational awareness by making it available to anyone who could read a scope. It represented everything Japanese doctrine taught officers to dismiss: mechanical complexity, technological dependence, the substitution of machines for warrior spirit. And it worked. It worked so consistently, so overwhelmingly, that by late 1943 Japanese commanders could no longer deny its importance. But acknowledgement came too late. Japan lacked the industrial capacity to match American radar production. They lacked the electronic components industry to manufacture sophisticated systems in quantity. They lacked the trained technicians to maintain and repair radar equipment in field conditions. Most critically, they lacked the doctrinal flexibility to fully integrate radar into their tactical systems. Their entire approach to aerial warfare had been built around assumptions that radar made obsolete. American bomber crews learned to trust their radar with an almost religious faith. In the darkness before dawn, in storms that reduced visibility to nothing, in the chaos of combat when adrenaline degraded human perception, the radar scope remained constant, a glowing circle of electronic truth that never panicked, never lost its nerve, never failed to see what was there to be seen. Staff Sergeant Robert Henley flew 37 more missions after that January morning above the Solomon Sea. He survived the war, returned to Iowa, and worked as a radio technician for 40 years. In interviews conducted late in his life, he consistently returned to that moment at 0447 hours when he first saw those blips appearing on his scope. "I knew right then," he said, "that the war had changed. Not just tactically, fundamentally. We could see them before they could see us. Everything else was just mathematics after that. They could be braver, more skilled, more experienced. None of it mattered if we knew where they were and they didn't know where we were. The machine had given us something that no amount of courage or training could overcome." The last Japanese pilot who had participated in that January 17th engagement survived the war. His name was Flight Petty Officer Kenji Yamada. In 1987, he participated in a joint American-Japanese symposium on Pacific War aviation history. During one session, he met Captain James Mitchell, the B-17 pilot who had commanded the bomber that morning 44 years earlier. Through a translator, they compared their experiences of that engagement. Yamada explained how his formation had executed what they believed was a perfect intercept, ideal timing, coordinated tactics, overwhelming numerical advantage. Mitchell explained how his radar operator had detected the Japanese formation 18 miles away, providing enough warning to completely negate the element of surprise. There was a long silence after the translation finished. Then Yamada said something that the translator hesitated to relay. Mitchell insisted. The translator finally spoke. He says that moment was when he first understood that Japan could not win the war. Not because of that single battle, but because of what it represented. He says the Americans had made a machine that could do what took Japanese pilots 10 years of training to do. And they could build those machines faster than Japan could train pilots. Mitchell nodded slowly. He thought about all the times radar had saved his life, all the engagements where electronic eyes had meant the difference between survival and death. He thought about the technological revolution that had transformed aerial warfare in just a few years. It wasn't just the machine, Mitchell finally said. It was what the machine represented, a different way of thinking about combat. We didn't try to make better warriors. We tried to make warriors who had better information. The radar wasn't better than a skilled pilot's instinct. But it gave average pilots something close to that instinct. And we had a lot of average pilots. Yamada considered this through the translator. Then he smiled, sad, knowing, accepting. Yes, he said. You made your warriors with factories. We tried to make ours with spirit. In the end, you had more warriors. The Pacific sky at dawn has not changed since 1943. The same gray light still creeps across the horizon. The same stars fade into morning. The same physics govern how radio waves reflect from metal surfaces, how electrons paint glowing trails across cathode ray tubes, how information transforms into tactical advantage. But what changed, what those Japanese pilots learned at terrible cost that January morning and in 1,000 other engagements across 3 years of war, was the relationship between man and machine in modern combat. The radar scope wasn't just a tool, it was a philosophical statement, a declaration that warfare had evolved beyond the point where individual warrior excellence could determine outcomes. The Japanese pilots who mocked American radar weren't fools. They were warriors operating within a worldview that emphasized human factors over mechanical ones, that valued spiritual strength over technical capability, that believed the cultivated human eye and instinct could never be replaced by machines. They were, in their way, right. Machines couldn't replace the skill and courage of trained pilots. But they could augment those qualities in ways that made the augmented warrior superior to even the most skilled warrior operating without augmentation. And in the brutal calculus of industrial warfare, augmented adequacy deployed in quantity defeated unaugmented excellence deployed in scarcity. The blips on that radar scope, glowing green in the pre-dawn darkness, represented more than 16 Japanese fighters closing for attack. They represented the future of warfare, a future where information was as important as ammunition, where the ability to see invisibly was as valuable as the ability to shoot accurately, where the warrior who knew more survived and the warrior who knew less, however skilled and brave, died. Staff Sergeant Henley, watching those blips crawl across his scope, had no grand philosophical insights in that moment. He was too busy calling out ranges and bearings, too focused on keeping his crew alive. But he was participating in a revolution nonetheless, not the dramatic kind celebrated in propaganda films, but the quiet, persistent kind that actually changes the world. One scope at a time. One engagement at a time. One dawn at a time. The radar hummed its electric song. The blips moved across the glowing screen. And somewhere in the darkness, men learned that the war they thought they were fighting had already become a different war entirely, one where seeing first meant everything, and machines had given sight to those who previously had to rely on dawn's slow arrival. That green glow became the light by which a new kind of warfare was born. And in its cold electronic illumination, old certainties about warrior spirit and human supremacy dissolve like morning mist under the tropical sun. Retriclod can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Script generation prompt, GenSpark. You are a professional cinematic historian and long-form scriptwriter specializing in WWII documentary narration. Your task is to expand the following title into a full historical cinematic script following the exact style of the WWII Tales competitor channel. Follow these locked rules. Opening scene. Begin with a short cinematic moment, time, place, sensory details. Like January 1940, January 17, 1940. Historical context. Transition into background explaining why this moment matters. Emotional contrast. Show what the German/Japanese soldiers expected versus what they actually experienced. Historical evidence. Weave in factual records, data, and documented quotes. Transformation. Highlight how the event or experience changed perception or ideology. Symbolism. Use one recurring symbolic object, food, weapon, or sound, to represent American abundance or democracy. Epilogue. End with poetic reflection linking that experience to a larger truth about freedom, abundance, or ideology. Tone. Cinematic, factual, emotional. Avoid dialogues and modern slang. Keep rhythm steady and documentary-like. 70% factual narration, 30% emotional reflection. Title: Japanese pilots mocked America's radar until B-17 crews detected them before dawn.